The Game Boy, a revelation, a brick, or the very foundation of the handheld gaming landscape we know and love today. A question we're about to take a deep dive into and find out how Nintendo made it all come together in a bona fide fashion. So sit back, grab some snacks, and let's get right into it.
Into the home. Taking it out of the home is another story. You can take it anywhere you want to go. Go. With the power of the NES.
The motivation in creating this video is a simple one. From discussing the PSP in my last video to the Game Boy in this one, a common pattern may be observed expressed among most millennials when looking back at all the tech they grew up with. One could say...
Nostalgia became a way of life. There wasn't a lot to look forward to. So people began looking back. Nothing is more addictive than the past.
No, put me back.
The Game Boy has gained some considerable recognition over the years via media such as magazines and newspapers, extending to world-renowned classic series such as The Simpsons.
And now, Portable Bartmania in Escape from Camp Deadly for Game Boy. Bartmania now comes 3 ways for your NES and Game Boy.
Malcolm in the Middle.
What are you talking about? Let's just say, pills and sandwich, not effective. Pills and milk, effective.
And Friends, amongst many others.
I'd say that chair's taking the brunt of it.
Marcel!
To its credit, the original Game Boy was also the very first game to be played in space, taken by Russian cosmonaut Alexander Serebov whilst on his 196-day mission on the Mir space station. That very Game Boy nearly traveled for 80 million kilometers before returning to Earth and set to be sold at an auction in 2011 for $1,220, with a note from Alexander stating, "During flight, in rare minutes of leisure, I enjoyed playing Game Boy." Naturally, this also secured Alexander a place in the Guinness World Records as the first person to play a video game in space. Last honorable mention, before I bore you to death, is the fact that an original Game Boy, surviving a bombing during the Gulf War, was displayed for a long time at the Nintendo World Store, New York City, which is a retail store with some museum-like exhibits. This, of course, is partially the reason the first Game Boy became known as the Brick, not only due to its minimalist boxy design, but also the rigid structural integrity which meant it could survive almost anything. Whilst Game Boy could not be considered as an eponym, it did become eponymously used in spoken language and synonymous with anything gaming related. Much like Thermos is a generic name which we commonly use to refer when talking about a vacuum-insulated flask used for keeping liquids hot or cold, or a Walkman when referring to a portable music player. This video will be focused around the original Game Boy and its revisions, but not iterations, so the Game Boy Color, Advance, Advance SP and Micro will not be included here, but you may look forward to those in the future. I will be segmenting the video as follows, and you will find the corresponding timestamps in the description right below that like and subscribe button. The first section will revolve around the background on the handheld gaming before the Game Boy. The second section will focus around how the idea of the Game Boy came to be. The third section will be about what exactly made the Game Boy a success. And the final section will be the conclusion and verdict of the Game Boy as a whole. Stating the Game Boy was the beginning of handheld gaming would definitely be ambitious, nor was it the first interchangeable cartridge-based system. However, in order of contextualizing, we would have to rewind the timeline further. So I'm gonna quickly brush over what handheld gaming was like before the Game Boy. Whilst the original Game Boy was indeed the console that popularized the interchangeable cartridge system, it would appear that the very first console introducing this sort of concept was the Milton Bradley Microvision released a full decade earlier in 1979. The Microvision was even more primitive than the Game Boy, but the way it worked was through the replaceable front panel, which served as a cartridge too, including both different buttons and screen overlay according to the needs and visuals of the game. It worked with a very low 16 by 16 pixel monochrome display and had a 12 button grid similar to a phone keypad, alongside a pedal dial or spinner knob, which was reminiscent of a rotary dial, allowing the player to have controls of turning left or right by twisting it respectively. Blockbuster was the most popular game and was packed in with the console, which some claim is a knockoff of Atari's Breakout, releasing a full 3 years earlier in 1976. Whilst the Microvision paved the way for handheld gaming's formation in the future, it suffered from a small gaming library having a total of 12 games being released, and also had a fragile LCD prone to breaking and fading. The other handheld interchangeable cartridge-based system released before the Game Boy,
The Micro Machine Man here presenting the genuine original, colossally collectible, most miniature episodes of the real.
yeah, I know, say that 5 times quickly. Anyhow, was the Epoch Game Pocket Computer, which was only released in Japan, and an even more obscure handheld than the Microvision. While it had a higher resolution of 74 by 64 pixels monochrome display, and saw the introduction of the D-pad or directional pad, it was even less successful than the Microvision, having only 5 game releases, a high price tag, and very weak third-party support, and landed it into the category of niche product obscurity. But Nintendo did exist back in 1979, right? You yell at me defending the Game Boy with all your might. Well, yes, Nintendo did exist in 1979, however didn't really have any handhelds released yet. It was developing its first handheld gaming console known as the Game & Watch, which was invented by the same person standing behind the Game Boy, namely Gunpei Yokoi. The Game & Watch released a year later in 1980. The usual Nintendo not relying on inventing the most cutting-edge technology, but breaking into the market with a completely different concept. Although, truth be told, the handhelds I mentioned were not a massive hit nor success for what they were, so perhaps they were not even seen as competitors. Yokoi was known for his philosophy of lateral thinking with withered technology, where he stated that the idea of a handheld console initially occurred to him on a train ride, where he witnessed a businessman playing with the calculator out of sheer boredom, leading the Game & Watch to feature a static segmented LCD display, which is quite reminiscent of what calculators and microwaves usually have in order of displaying different numbers. In other words, by turning on certain segments of the display and other segments off. Implementing such technology to a games console meant that the Game & Watch was usually limited to one arcade-style game with, so to speak, pre-drawn graphics, often based around the timing and coordination. The difficulty increased usually by the ever-increasing speed of the game, however remained unchanged in terms of its objective. The Game & Watch also functioned as a watch when not used for gaming, which was perhaps seen as another persuasive selling point by Nintendo. Naturally, using this simple technology allowed Nintendo to keep the price quite low, usually selling each Game & Watch for around $20 to $25. Couple this with the established Nintendo branding of characters such as Donkey Kong, Mario, and Zelda among others, and the Game & Watch quickly gained popularity. So much so that Nintendo discontinued the Game & Watch series in 1991, which was 2 years after the Game Boy's release. Yokoi saw the potential in handheld gaming with the Game & Watch series, however also acknowledged the limitations this series had, like ability to only play a single game. Modularity seemed like the right move here, and what I mean is that much like phones and smartphones eventually lost their keyboards and buttons in favor of bigger touchscreens that empowered more versatility, as Steve Jobs broke it down in his spectacular historic moment of the first iPhone unveiling.
And they all have these control buttons that are fixed in plastic and are the same for every application. Well, every application wants a slightly different user interface, a slightly optimized set of buttons just for it. It doesn't work because the buttons and the controls can't change. They can't change for each application. Well, how do you solve this? It turns out we have solved it. But what we're going to do is get rid of all these buttons and just make a giant screen. A giant screen.
In a similar fashion, one of the natural increments from the Game & Watch to the Game Boy was in the screen department. The Game & Watch's segmented display was dropped in exchange for a monochrome dot matrix LCD with a resolution of 160 by 144 pixels. The Game Boy's screen had a refresh rate of 60 Hz and was non-backlit with the intent of battery life preservation. By widening the horizon with the display upgrade, Nintendo's new handheld was naturally liberated in the gaming department. To completely materialize this, Yokoi likely took a few notes from the Microvision and improved upon it conceptually. The idea of interchangeable cartridges was administered in the Game Boy, which was another major conceptual step up from the Game & Watch. Another area which was enhanced upon the Microvision, which used a 9-volt battery and offered 5 to 6 hours of playtime, the Game Boy went on to using 4 AA's instead, and offered over 30 hours of playing time. The D-pad or direction pad had gained popularity by this time, but it also could be the case that Yokoi took some notes from the Epoch Game Pocket computer, which had one and implemented it into the first Game Boy, allowing for more versatility with movement in games over the Microvision's knob. The other notable change was the application of interchangeable cartridges, which meant that you now had a single console, which was energy efficient, had a dot matrix LCD, which allowed the rendition of different graphics according to each game's needs, and also had a D-pad for better controls. In essence, Nintendo took ideas from various predecessors, improved upon them, and combined them in a single handheld, which was to experience a booming success soon after its release. Pointing toward a single thing about the Game Boy and coining it to be the sole factor that made it a success would be unfair and likely untrue. I look at the Game Boy as one of those matters that happened due to being in the right place, at the right time, at the right, well, you know what I mean. Moving on swiftly, in my opinion, based on facts and what history has presented us with, as believe it or not, the original Game Boy was released a whole 6 years before I was born, so I cannot particularly say I was somebody growing up with the system. There were some pivotal factors that projected the Game Boy to the handheld juggernaut it became. As mentioned earlier, Nintendo, or more likely Gunpei Yokoi, had the motto of lateral thinking with withered technology, which to some extent the company is known for to this day. It also does hold true for the original Game Boy. Yokoi believed that players didn't care a whole lot about the technical aspects like the graphics of the games, but rather the experience a game provided. One may say Nintendo saw the big picture with the invention of the Game Boy. A dot matrix LCD, albeit a step up from a segmented display, was far from the most cutting-edge technology that existed back in 1989. In fact, its competitors, namely the Atari Lynx that released the same year, the Sega Game Gear and Turbo Express, both releasing a year later, all had color displays, whereas the original Game Boy could display 4 shades of grey, or more likely this horrid swampy green color. Color displays back in those days, however, were in their infancy, and that naturally equated to them being expensive. The infancy factor I just mentioned also contributes to the fact that they were also quite power hungry, allowing for 3 to 6 hours for the Atari Lynx, Game Gear and Turbo Express while running on 6 AA batteries. Compare that with the Game Boy's energy efficient dot matrix LCD, which allowed up to 30 hours on 4 AA's, and it was an easy home run for Nintendo. A domino effect is created here as more batteries also meant that the systems became heavier and thus less portable in a sense. What a turn of events that may sound to some, as the brick Game Boy, funnily enough, was considered quite portable back in 1989 when stacked against its competition. Users would have to choose between a backlit color display, which ran through batteries like a lunatic, or settle for a less impressive black and white dot matrix LCD, which could last for 5 to 7 times longer for only 2/3 of the batteries. Continuing on the domino effect, needing more batteries would also mean that users would need to buy batteries more often, adding to the cost of the unit down the line to simply use it. And let's be real here, a lot of the buyers of said consoles and consequently batteries were parents, ultimately adding more star points to the appeal of the Game Boy for them too. Continuing somewhat on the same subject of batteries, the Game Boy was not defeated solely on the screens and visuals department by its rivals. The so to speak horsepower under the hood also paled in comparison to its competitors at the time. This should not come as a surprise, as rendering different color stripes automatically equated to needing more processing power. The closest processor in terms of abilities was the one of the Sega Game Gear, which ran at a slightly lower clock speed but handled 16-bit operations and graphics better than the Game Boy. The Game Boy had a Sharp LR35902, which was actually a cut-down version of the Z80 CPU, whereas the Game Gear's Z80 CPU was generally 1.5 to 2 times more powerful than the Game Boy's CPU in real-world performance. The Turbo Express had an approximately 1.7 times faster CPU, and the Atari Lynx trumped over all the rest with its 3.8 times more powerful CPU, and also boasted a custom graphics chip facilitating in this great segregation from the rest of the competition. So what did the Game Boy have going for it with its seemingly crappier CPU? Well, the Game Boy's CPU was designed to be very power efficient, and thus required less power than its competitors. Topped it off with lower manufacturing costs, and one would likely already have a solidified winner. The advantages don't stop there, however, as the Game Boy CPU was indeed withered technology, and what withered technology meant for developers was simplicity, which made it easier to program for, also trickling down into the sphere of hardware optimization. A platform which was easier to develop for meant it was preferred by software creators, which leads us to yet another ace Nintendo had up its sleeve. As you may have anticipated, the simpler development meant that more developers preferred the Game Boy platform, and thus more games were created for it. How many more, you ask? 1,046 total games, equate to almost 3 times as many as the runner-up, which was the Sega Game Gear. I will not mention the rest of the competition, if you can even call them that at this stage, to let them out with some dignity, as it's starting to look like a very single-sided battle. Again, a domino effect in this front is created too, as the more games created, the greater audiences reached, ultimately adding to the Game Boy being the preferred console. I want to also add a caveat here, in that the Game Boy wasn't really betting on mass production and compromising on quality here, like many companies tend to do. As a matter of fact, the Game Gear's top seller was Sonic the Hedgehog 2, selling about 400,000 copies, whereas the Game Boy's 24th and 25th bestsellers in the face of the Game & Watch Gallery and Mortal Kombat had the equivalent approximate, showing the vast disparity of the Game Boy's lead over the competition. It was not edging out its competition, it was winning by a landslide. I mentioned the specific names of the games as this was a part of Nintendo's strategy. You see, Nintendo owned multiple franchises that were solidified in the gaming landscape, like Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Donkey Kong, and Metroid, among many others. However, the booming success of the Game Boy, or at least the head start it got, was highly attributed to one particular game.
I played for 5 minutes. I still see falling blocks in my dreams. It's poetry, art, and math all working in magical synchronicity. It's the perfect game. Tetris?
Tetris.
Tetris. Tetris. It's a combination of tetra, Greek for 4, and tennis.
Tennis.
The Russian inventor, he likes tennis.
Sneasel. This game isn't just addictive, it stays with you.
This is the inventor of Tetris.
Your game is brilliant. I'm gonna make you a millionaire.
Mr. Rogers, have you ever negotiated with the Soviets?
We're here for Tetris.
Вы все здесь только ради денег.
What do you say? I don't speak Russian. Hi, Hank Rogers, Bulletproof Software. It is an honor to be here.
Hello, Hank. Minoru Arakawa, President of Nintendo of America.
Hank, goddamn Rogers. Welcome to Seattle. Howard Lincoln, Senior VP, Chief Legal Counsel.
This game is programmed in C, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
How many pixels?
160 by 144. Why?
It's not perfect, but you'll get the idea. Gentlemen, if you want to sell a couple 100,000 Game Boys to little kids, package them with Mario. But if you want to sell millions of Game Boys to absolutely everyone, young and old, around the world, package them with Tetris.
Last but not least, Nintendo putting all the pieces mentioned thus far together and sealing the deal with its aggressive pricing. All the mentioned not so cutting edge but functional and easy to develop for hardware allowed Nintendo to have a profit margin on a price that was lower than all its competitors. The Game Boy launch price was $89.99 in dollars, which adjusted for inflation would equate to about $202 or 186 euros. The Game Gear costed approximately 1.5 times as much at $149.99, approximately equating to $322 today, whereas the Lynx was twice the price of the Game Boy. The Turbo Express was in a league of its own in terms of its astronomical pricing, with its launch price being $249.99, equating to about $537 or 494 euros today. The aggressive pricing Nintendo presented was a compelling reason in and of itself, but it also ran on less batteries, which further allowed more buffer for game purchases down the line. Speaking of game purchases and pricing, the Game Boy offered the cheapest game prices on average. Naturally, games were not all equal in price, however when considering the average, the price of a Game Boy game costed approximately $29.99, equating to about $68 today or 64 euros. The Game Gear and Lynx had an increment of $10 increase over the Game Boy's games, with a price of $39.99 respectively, which is about $91 or 86 euros today. And the Turbo Express, being the most luxurious, so to speak, topped the Game Gear's prices by another $10 at $49.99, which is about $114 or 107 euros today for a single game. In essence, the Game Boy not only offered the largest games library by far, but also offered each game at the cheapest price. Looking at things in retrospect, it is no wonder why Nintendo won the fourth console generation war in such a dominant fashion. Ultimately, Nintendo's vision of Wither technology and what it had going for it was the fact that it had been around long enough to be cheap to manufacture and also well understood, which consequently would mean that using and implementing it was a lot easier. In the Game Boy's case, this meant not only that the screen was cheap to manufacture and power efficient to run, but also that the platform was very well comprehended by game developers, which ultimately played a key role in the software development and thus to a great extent its success. A summary of its success would look and sound something like this.
Eight-bit graphics?
Yes.
And a brand new Sharp LR35902 core at 4.19 MHz with 8 kilobytes internal RAM. Impressive. No color screen?
Color, you need 8 batteries instead of 4. It's too expensive. This gives you 30 hours of gameplay, all for $89.
What's it called?
It's called the Game Boy. Go ahead, try it.
Of course, competitors had no shortage of a teasing banter and taking shots at Nintendo's new proud pioneering innovation. Sega especially had a way of, so to speak, tease Nintendo about this, as their home consoles were also more powerful, where Sega always claimed that
what Nintendo don't.
But later also continued with the boy whacking himself across the head to start seeing his Game Boy in color.
Whoa. Color.
Hey, there's an easier way to get color. Get a Game Gear, the full color portable with over 150 games, like the new Echo, Mortal 2, and Sonic Triple Trouble. Sega!
Another even more provocative ad was basically calling out the Game Boy to be trash, while encouraging users to recycle and showing uses like fixing a wobbly chair or petting a cat, among other uses, where you can decide whether or not this is a friendly banter or a full-fledged open war.
Is still no excuse. Use them to tenderize meat, or even as sunblock. Please help save the planet.
Now, don't be fooled into assuming Sega was the only company tossing puns at the Game Boy, as you would most certainly be wrong. Atari did their own share of puns as seen in magazines. However, one thing remains in common. Competitors all targeted Nintendo, further confirming that the Game Boy was seen as the main threat when it came to market share. And while as mentioned earlier I didn't have a Game Boy growing up myself, I did acquire one in my 20s, purely out of interest and appreciation for retro tech. My own verdict after holding and using a Game Boy is that it felt nothing like a luxurious or flashy item, but rather more like a piece of industrial equipment, which wasn't sleek, but purely built for function. One can say the Game Boy's design language followed suit with Nintendo's aesthetic of the time, in mirroring the functional no-frills ethos seen in the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's simply something very Nintendo-esque, with its utilitarian form, subdued color palette, ergonomic or lack thereof ergonomic shape, and emphasis on durability echoing throughout the design philosophy that defined Nintendo's hardware at the time. All in all, Ultimate Nintendo showed the competition how deep the rabbit hole went. I thank each and every one of you for taking the time to watch this video, and do let me know in the comments box down below whether you think Nintendo's success was pure coincidence of being in the right place at the right time, or a carefully studied and implemented strategy by its creators, or maybe a bit of both. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one.